Okay, so before we get this list started, I'd just like to list off the parks that I've been to in case you have a coaster in your top 15 that you don't see on this list. Currently, I have 94 total credits, and so I've only ridden just under 100 coasters. So you might see something on here that might be against your opinion, and that just is because maybe I haven't ridden the same coasters that you have. So the list of parks that I've been to is my home park, Six Flags Great America. I've been to Cedar Point, Busch Gardens Tampa, Busch Gardens Williamsburg, Kings Island, the Mall of America, Dollywood, Carowinds, but I only got about 5 credits there due to the Winterfest, Indiana Beach Amusement Park, Six Flags Fiesta Texas, which I don't include in this rankings because I didn't ride until 2023, and then Mount Olympus in Wisconsin, as well as Zip and Pippin in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Coming in at number 15 is Hades 360. This is a gravity group wooden coaster built at Mount Olympus in Wisconsin. The highlight of this ride is definitely the tunnel underneath the parking lot. It's a very unique feature that you don't see a lot on other coasters. It's a very long tunnel and it is pitch black down there. It gives a great feeling of disorientation as you bounce around in the tunnel before popping out on the other side right into an inversion. It's a great ride. It's a lot of fun. It's a unique ride. It's something different, and you get a lot of airtime moments, a lot of ejector pops of airtime with a couple of floater moments put in there. It's a great wooden roller coaster. It's definitely worth a ride if you can get out to Wisconsin, and it is my number 15 coaster. Coming in at number 14 is the Lost Coaster of Superstition Mountain. This is a little bit more of an obscure coaster. It's located at Indiana Beach Amusement Park in Indiana. Before this was a roller coaster, it was actually a dark ride, and that's kind of how it gets its unique nature. It's a very interesting ride. It's something very different, and the fact that it has no restraints just improves the ride and makes it so much more fun. It's not a stat monster. The top drop height is only 35 feet and only tops out at 20 miles per hour, but it is just so much fun and it's such an out of control feeling for a ride. The fact that you have no restraints, the possibility of riding this backwards, and the way it just maneuvers through this tiny little mountain is just so much fun. Every moment on this coaster was just a blast from start to finish. And if you have a chance to stop at Indiana Beach on like maybe a different trip going out to Ohio or something like that, it is worth a stop. That's why it's my number 14 coaster because it is different and I just love this coaster. Coming in at lucky number 13 is Nighthawk, located at Carowinds. This is a Vekoma Flying Dutchman coaster. There's not very many of these left, and it is a bit of like a history credit. I came in just expecting to get a fun little credit, something I can say I rode before they decided to close the ride. But I ended up falling in love with this ride. Every time I got off of it, I was just laughing and smiling, and it's just such a fun ride. The highlight of this coaster for me was the vertical loop. Because this is a flying coaster, you actually start the loop on your back before standing straight up, flipping over, and ending back up on your back at the bottom of the loop. And it's a unique feeling. It's not quite similar to the pretzel loops, but it gives more of a floating feeling than the positive G's that the pretzel loops of the B&M flyers give. But this coaster was just so much fun. I ended up lapping it multiple times while I was at the park, and it was just such a surprise to me that not more people talk about this coaster. It was a little rough, but it is an older ride, so keep that in mind when you ride it. But every time I got off this ride, I was just having a great time, and it had to be in this list, so I put it at number 13. Coming in at number 12 is the Loch Ness Monster. This is an aero looping model located at Busch Gardens, Williamsburg. The highlight of this coaster is definitely the interlocking loops. It's a unique feature that you don't see on a lot of coasters, and especially nowadays, you don't see it. But this coaster, for me, is a huge piece of history, and that's why I enjoyed riding it so much. I like riding coasters that are history, and this definitely fits the bill. It's a huge step in the right direction, not just for aero, but for coasters in general. But being an aero coaster, this is one of their smoother examples of the looping model. It's definitely smoother than, like, let's say, Dimond at Great America. It still has a little bit of a shake, but not nearly as violent as other coasters, making it a lot more rideable for everyone. And it actually is kind of a little bit of a re-rideable aero coaster. I love this coaster. It was a blast to ride, and it comes in at my number 12 spot. Coming in at number 11 is Millennium Force at Cedar Point. This is their Intamin Giga model. It's actually the first Giga. And for that fact alone, for me, it's worth riding. It's another huge piece of history, especially at Cedar Point. The first coaster to break the 300-foot barrier. And it's actually a fun ride to ride as well. A lot of people like to call it Millennium Forceless, but I just don't believe that hype. The first pullout after the drop actually pulled some G's, and I grayed out personally. It does have a couple of airtime moments as well. But the highlight of this ride is definitely the speed, and it showcases that very well. From the moment you dropped off the lift hill all the way to the last set of brakes, it carries its speed, and it's a lot of fun for me personally, and I love this ride. And it's another huge piece of history to ride at Cedar Point. All right, we are breaking the top 10 with Dimond Back at Kings Island. This is a B&M hypermodel, and the highlight of this ride is definitely the airtime. The first drop, the 4-second airtime hill, the camelbacks. Well, that's what this ride is all about, is airtime. And if you're an airtime lover, this is definitely the coaster for you. This is not my top B&M hyper, but it's definitely near the top of the list. It's a fun ride. It has a splashdown as well, which is really cool. And it's just from the moment you drop off the lift hill to the end of the brakes, it's just airtime moment after airtime moment after airtime moment. It's not ejector airtime, but it is sustained long-term floater, and that's something I personally absolutely love in a coaster. Kings Island has a super, super stacked lineup, and this coaster tops their list. Coming in at number 9 is the polar opposite of Diamondback. It is Montu at Busch Gardens, Tampa. This is a B&M invert model, and it's a very intense one at that. From the moment you drop off the first hill all the way until the final brakes, this coaster carries its speed very well, and that's because of the trenches that they built. It stays very low to the ground, and on each inversion hits very, very hard. It makes this coaster a super intense G-force filled machine, and every element just feels like it wants to rip your feet off. It's a great ride at Busch Gardens, Tampa, and it's a great B&M overall. It's my favorite all of the invert models, and it's just a fun ride, and it is worth a trip to the park to ride it. Coming in at number 8 is another B&M Hyper model. It's my favorite B&M Hyper, and it is Raging Bull at Six Flags Great America. The highlight of this ride for me is definitely the first drop. The amount of ejector airtime you get in the back row on the first drop is almost unbeatable by any other ride. In my opinion, a first drop can make or break a roller coaster, and in this case, it definitely makes it. It's one of my favorite first drops of all time. This coaster is also a little bit more of a unique ride because it is their twister layout versus an out and back layout like most B&M Hypers are, making it a more unique and individual ride compared to the rest of the B&M Hypers. It's also at my home park, so I have a special place in my heart for this ride. And I just love riding this coaster every time I ride it. It's got a lot of airtime moments, but it's also got some intense G-force filled moments at the end with the helixes, and the big tall turnarounds as well have some intense pullouts. I just really enjoy riding this every time I get on it, and it's one of my favorite rides, and it comes in at number 8. Coming in at number 7 is another Six Flags Great America coaster. It is my favorite coaster at the park, and it is also the first RMC to be featured on this list. It is Goliath. Now, this is their steel topper track design, and it is a fully wooden roller coaster instead of a hybrid like the other RMCs out there. And it is also a ground up construction, making it a more unique RMC to be featured in the park. Now, this coaster has an impossibly tall first drop, and part of that has to do with it actually drops below grade. So the overall height of the lift hill is actually less than the overall height of the drop. And for that reason, it makes it a really, really good first drop. It's a little bit surprising because it doesn't look as big as it actually is. This coaster has some really, really good elements, and it doesn't have as many as other RMCs, but each element hits and pops out really, really, really hard. It also features a dive loop, which I believe is not on any other RMC, but it is just a great, great ride. Every element hits very hard, but the highlight for me is definitely the zero G stall. It just seems impossibly long, and you're upside down. It's upside down airtime, and it is just a blast to go through every time. It's one of my favorite elements out there, like overall, which is why this coaster makes this list and comes in at number 7. Coming in at number 6 is another Cedar Point coaster, and it is Magnum XL 200. Now, this is Arrow's attempt at a hypermodel, and it's definitely a great attempt. Now, if you really want to experience this coaster for its full potential, you have to take a ride in the Magic Seat. Now, it is the row 3 of the first car, and for some reason, the airtime in that seat just seems to hit very, very hard. It is one of the more painful rides. It's definitely painful, ejector-filled airtime. And the bunny hills at the end of the ride are definitely why this makes this list. It's a great coaster at Cedar Point. It's another huge piece of history, the first coaster to break the 200-foot mark. The coaster is definitely ahead of its time, and I think you can tell that just by the way it's designed and constructed and the way the coaster runs. But it is so much fun, almost an out of control airtime feeling. Like I said, it is a little bit painful, so you'd have to put up with that a little bit. But I will do that every time to get a ride on this coaster. It's never a long wait at Cedar Point due to the other rides at the park, and it's just such a fun coaster. It has a lot of character to it. It has some history, so it's all right. It climbs up this list, but it's a great, fun, exciting ride at Cedar Point. All right, we are breaking the top 5 coasters on my favorite coasters list with Lightning Rod at Dollywood. This is another RMC to be featured on this list, and obviously the big kicker of this ride is the LSM lift hill. It was, when it opened, it was considered to be the only launched wooden roller coaster. Obviously, it's no longer a wooden roller coaster, and I think that was actually an improvement on the ride, in my opinion. It's definitely smooth, and the parts that they didn't convert to the steel iBox track, you can definitely tell it's a little bit rougher. So I think it helped improve the ride. I actually rode this coaster on 2 very separate different occasions. And the first time I rode it, I was actually underwhelmed. It didn't even make it into my top 15. Um, it just seemed to be running slow. It didn't do as much as it did as I was expecting it to. And every element was just kind of like, it's there, but it didn't really pop punch. Now, the second time I rode it, we got 2 rides at the end of the night, and I swear they had to like turn the launch up or something because it just seemed like every element was hitting so good and so hard. And then it shot back up into my top 15 at number 5. Now, this coaster is all about the airtime for me. The launch lift hill is all right, it's cool, but it's definitely all about the airtime. The quad down at the end, the sideways airtime you get on the wave turns, and this coaster is just so much fun from start to finish. It's definitely a unique ride being built in the hills down at Dollywood, and it is a blast. It's my favorite ride at Dollywood, and it makes my list at number 5. Coming in at number 4 is my favorite ride at Kings Island, and it is Mystic Timbers. Now, this is a GCI Woody. Me personally, I'm a huge fan of wooden roller coasters to begin with, and this is definitely my favorite out of the bunch. This coaster is all about the great pacing. After you drop off the first hill, you just get hit and hit and hit repeatedly. It carries its speed all the way until the final brakes, and it just pounds you and pounds you and pounds you with airtime. And it dives back and forth, and it goes over the water and turns around in the woods. It's definitely an upgrade over the Beast, just because it has more forces, but it still kind of goes through the woods just like the Beast does. It's one of my favorite rides, obviously, just being at number 4, but it's one of my favorite wooden roller coasters. I absolutely love this ride. The shed for me didn't really disappoint. It was kind of nice to have something to do while you were sitting on the final brakes waiting to get unloaded. It does kind of suck because you have to ride in the front row to get the full experience. And this ride is definitely a back row ride. That's where all the forces are. It does have a twisted first drop as well, which isn't my favorite. But for some reason, this coaster, I just fell in love. We rode it like 3 or 4 times at the beginning of the day just because of how awesome of a ride it really was. And it's my favorite ride at Kings Island, and it's definitely worth a ride. Coming in at number 3 is another Cedar Point ride, and it is Maverick. Now, this is their Intimate Blitz model, and it is a very intense coaster. Now, this coaster is kind of the reason I became a coaster enthusiast to begin with. My first time at Cedar Point, my family was out there, and I was about 15 years old at the time, and I didn't know anything about coasters. Cedar Point was just on a list that I wanted to go to. So we got out there, and we got to ride a few coasters out there, make it to the back of the park, and we got to Maverick, and we actually skipped it. So I didn't know anything about coasters, and to me, it was just a small coaster at the back of the park with a really long wait for no reason. So we just skipped it and moved on. We rode Mean Streak and a couple of the rides back there. And by the end of the night, of course, my family's all coastered out, and I'm a coaster nerd at this point. So I went to the back of the park to ride it. So I waited the really long wait time for it, but I came off just absolutely impressed by this ride and disappointed that the rest of my family didn't even get to ride it. It is whippy, it is intense, it's got positive G's, it's got airtime, and it is just so much fun to ride. The launched lift hill is awesome. The launch after the mid course is great. And I know a lot of people try to hate on this ride sometimes. I just think it gets more hate than it actually deserves. It's such a fun ride at Cedar Point. It's one of the best rides at Cedar Point, and I just absolutely love this ride. And I try to get a ride on it every time I make it to Cedar Point. Coming in at number 2 is probably a little bit different of a number 2 than other people, but for me, it's my number 2 coaster, and it is Fury 325 at Carowinds. Now, this is B&M's Giga version, and it is a great ride. It's definitely my favorite Giga out of the 3 that I've been on. And just to compare it to like Orion at Kings Island, because they are built by the same manufacturer, the two coasters aren't even in the same stratosphere. Fury 325 is just so much better, in my opinion. And it just has great airtime, a super awesome first drop, which is one of the reasons why I love B&Ms to begin with. They all have great drops, but this is definitely up there as my favorite drop. It just seems to keep going and going and going because the coaster is such a tall ride. The thing that I really enjoyed about this coaster is the fact that it doesn't just have airtime hills. Every time you seem to pop up, it's going to the left or to the right. So you get some laterals with your airtime in each individual element. And to me, that just seems to put the coaster in a different field all on its own. The treble cuff element is a great element visually and also to ride on. The airtime that you get at the top before diving down into the Fury Tunnel is awesome. This ride just put a smile on my face, and it was only like 42 degrees, and it was still running awesome. I was there at the winter event. I literally drove like 6.5 hours just to ride this ride, even though the park only had like 5 rides open, and it was such a great ride. It was worth it. I love this ride, and it's my number 2 coaster. All right, we have reached my number 1 favorite coaster that I have ridden, and we got a little bit of a controversy. So, my favorite coaster is Iron Gawzi at Busch Gardens, Tampa. Now, the coaster you guys were probably all expecting to see at my number 1 was probably Steel of Vengeance, but Iron Gawzi did for me everything that Steel Vengeance didn't. Now I know I need to get back to Cedar Point to ride Steel Vengeance. I didn't quite have a clear head and a clear mind when I wrote it. I will say that, but I'm a bit of a Steel Vengeance hater at this point. I feel like Iron Gwazi is just way better. Now this coaster is my number 1, and it was actually the easiest coaster for me to rank on this list. It just seems like every other coaster isn't even close to it. RMC really pulled out all the stops for this coaster, and I was in Florida, so I was able to ride it, and it is just so much fun. It has my favorite inversion of all time with the death roll. It's a barrel roll as you're diving towards the ground, and in the back row, you just get so much whip. It feels like your face is going to fly off. It is a great ride, great airtime, one of the best drops of all time. It is glass smooth because it is an RMC hybrid, and it is just so much fun. It is my number 1 coaster. Steel Vengeance is not. In fact, I don't even have it on this list. Like I said, I do need to re-ride Steel Vengeance, but Iron Gwazi is by far the best coaster. and every other coaster on this list just is blown out of the water by it. Airtime, intensity. I even grayed out after the first drop, pulling up into the first element. And I just love this coaster. I did get to ride it on a hot day in Florida, which probably improves its odds compared to the rest of the coasters. But it is just so much fun, and it is my number one coaster that I've ever ridden. All right, so that will do it for my top 15 coasters. If you want to see more content from me, you can like, comment, and subscribe. I plan on doing a few different things with coaster rankings, along with park reviews. If you have something specifically that you want to see, go ahead and drop a comment, and I'll consider making a video for that content. I definitely appreciate all the views I can get, and I hope you all have a great day.